Joining us now, we have Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator Coons is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the Judiciary Committee. Senator, I want to ask you, looking at these images of smoke rising over Tel Aviv, what we know about Israel's attacks on Tehran overnight, where does this put the U.S.? What is the U.S. position in the Middle East now? Because we've heard from the White House that they did have prior knowledge, but that's not the same as prior approval. But that doesn't make it any more complicated for the Trump administration to try to negotiate with Iran right now.
Well, Christina, that's right. We're in a very challenging and dangerous moment. And my first concern, of course, is about the safety of the men and women of the American Armed Forces who are serving throughout the region. Tens of thousands of our service members are deployed throughout the Middle East in different bases in different countries. And it's my hope that Iran will not strike them. Recognizing, as President Trump said, that we did not authorize or participate in this preemptive attack on Iran, that Iran will hold back from attacking any Americans. But we also have to be mindful there's hundreds of thousands of American citizens who live in Israel and who even now, as Iran is launching its response attacks into Israel, that puts at risk the lives of Israeli civilians and a significant number of Americans as well. I'm encouraged that President Trump had been trying to negotiate a deal with Iran to constrain their aggressive actions in the region, their missile program, their support for dangerous proxies like the Houthis and Hamas and Hezbollah, and to significantly constrain or end their nuclear program. President Trump is calling on the Iranians to come to the negotiating table and make a strong and lasting deal fast. I will remind you, part of why we were not in an agreement with Iran that constrained their nuclear program was because President Trump in his previous term walked away from it, even though back then we had real partnership from China, Russia, and our European allies in pursuing that path. So part of what precipitated this attack on Iran by Israel in the last few days was a finding by the International Atomic Watchdog that Iran had significantly increased its enrichment and Iran's response, announcing yet another enrichment facility. I will be looking for a classified update when I return to Washington to make sure I understand the details of these attacks, the justification offered by the Israeli government, and the consequences for stability and security in the region.
And, Senator, I want to pause right now because we have live images of the skyline of Tel Aviv, and it's hard to tell at this point what is going on, but it appeared another interceptor just went off and met something there in the sky. You can see the camera panning to what looked like lights, possibly rockets, possibly missiles heading in the sky over Tel Aviv. We'll wait for confirmation as to what exactly is going on there. But I also want to ask you about the complications of this for the United States, because the U.S. policy is so inextricably tied with Israeli policy, given the decades of strong allyship between those two countries, that when there is a division on how to proceed, like in Iran, you know, this administration, the past administration have both tried to hold back the reins on this out of fear that this conflict could spill over and ignite the region. No matter what Israel does, it seems Iran is going to tie it to the United States. We have the Iranian foreign minister today saying, quote, without this attack could not have happened without the coordination and approval of the United States. How do you get around that? Do you think you should see, do you want to see a more strenuous, strongly worded separation from the White House? Or is it in America's best interest to try to get on board and salvage what they can within the terms that have already been set by Netanyahu at this point?
Well, look, Secretary of State Marco Rubio put out a statement last night that tried to make that separation, to make it clear that the Trump administration had not approved or facilitated or supported these attacks on Iran, and was largely silent on what position the Trump administration was taking on Israel's attack on Iran. I have long supported Israel's right to defend itself. And along with many Democrats and Republicans in Congress, I've said for years that we cannot tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran. But I have also long preferred a diplomatic path, if at all possible, because every assessment I've gotten in the past was that a military end to Iran's nuclear program was not feasible, and in fact might actually drive them more rapidly into the direction of developing a usable nuclear weapon. In the last few years, Iran has dramatically increased its enrichment activity. I think they are a more dangerous regional player. And I think it's hard to talk about this region in this context without also mentioning the horrific attack on Israel by Hamas on October 7th and the consequences that has had for the region, for Gaza, for the population of Gaza, and the striking actions by Israel against Hezbollah. This entire region has fundamentally been reshaped in the events after October 7th. And we in the Congress need to be engaged in a constructive way in setting a better path forward that can reduce the risk to the region from Iran's aggression, its support for its proxies, and to try and find a path that will end Iran's nuclear program.
Netanyahu and the Israeli government have said their hand was forced. They couldn't wait because Iran suddenly seemed very close within days of reaching that breakout time, which is that threshold 90% enriched uranium, which could be used to make a functional nuclear weapon. You get much better briefings than I do, sir. Does that track with the intelligence that you've been following? Was Iran really that close to having a functional weapon, or was there more room here for negotiation?
I'm going to be getting a classified briefing when I return to Washington early next week. As I just shared with you, it's public information that the IAEA, which is the world's nuclear watchdog agency, declared last week that Iran was outside of its non-proliferation treaty obligations. That's a technical way of saying Iran was making dangerous and rapid progress towards having enough fissile material for a weapon. That's distinct from actually having a working weapon, but they were clearly making progress in that direction. They have a large stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. President Trump and his emissary, Mr. Witkoff, have been trying to negotiate with Iran a deal that would constrain this program. Their next negotiating session was supposed to be this Sunday, and President Trump is still urging them to come back to the table and to voluntarily give up their nuclear program. We'll see whether this action by Israel creates that possibility or whether several days of military exchanges will make that impossible.
All right, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today, sir.